At 2 minutes to midnight, on 6 November 1956, Anthony Eden put down the telephone to Paris and told his cabinet that the ceasefire would not be accepted. The armoured column south of Port Said had been ordered to halt on the line it held, some 23 miles down the canal, short of Ismailia and far short of Suez City at the southern end. Eden countermanded the halt. Guy Mollet, who had spent the evening arguing that the operation must not stop with the waterway half taken, confirmed within the hour that French forces would continue alongside the British. The road to that midnight had been 18 weeks long and entirely public. On 26 July, weeks after Washington and London withdrew financing for the Aswan High Dam, Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company before a crowd in Alexandria. At Sèvres, between 22 and 24 October, Britain, France, and Israel signed the protocol that arranged an Israeli attack into Sinai to serve as the pretext for an Anglo-French intervention to separate the combatants. Israel crossed on 29 October. The ultimatum followed on 30 October, the air campaign against Egyptian airfields on 31 October, the airborne landings at Port Said and Port Fouad on the 5th of November, the seaborne landings on 6th of November. Every stage had gone broadly to plan, and every stage had cost Britain something that could not be recovered. The case Eden made to his colleagues was not the case of a sick man raving. Though he was ill, the bile duct damaged in the botched operation of 1953, the stimulants and sedatives carrying him through the crisis. His argument was one serious people made. A half-seized canal was worse than none. It left Nasser standing, the waterway blocked, the humiliation absorbed, and nothing bought with it. Finish the operation in 72 hours, hold the length of the ditch, and negotiate afterwards from possession rather than from failure. Harold Macmillan, who had been first among the Hawks in July, said little. He had seen the reserve figures. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently, because what nobody in that room fully grasped, on either side of the argument, was that the thing they were fighting to seize had already ceased to exist as an asset, and the men who would decide Britain's fate over the following month were not in Cairo or in Moscow. They were in Washington, and they had already made up their minds. The column took Ismailia on 8 of November. Regular Egyptian resistance thinned as it went, because the Egyptian army had been beaten in Sinai and around Port Said and had few formations left to feed into the canal zone. What replaced it was worse. Nasser's government had begun distributing rifles to civilians on 1 November, and the National Liberation Army that formed in the Delta towns had no need to win engagements. It only had to make the road unsafe. By 12 November, British and French troops stood in Suez City. The whole length of the waterway, 101 miles from the Mediterranean to the Gulf of Suez, lay under Anglo-French occupation. It was the objective. It had been achieved. It was worthless. Egypt had begun scuttling ships in the Channel on 31 October. And by the time the column reached the southern end, there were more than 40 wrecks in the canal. Clearing them required specialized salvage vessels, months of work, and the consent of the country whose territory sat on both banks. Egypt would not give that consent to an occupying army. The canal that Britain had gone to war to keep open would not open. Britain now garrisoned a ditch full of sunken ships running through 100 miles of hostile country and had to pay for it in dollars it did not have. Eisenhower had been re-elected on 6th of November. He learned of the British refusal the following morning and treated it as exactly what it was, a public defiance by an ally that had lied to him about its intentions since July. He had already voted with the Soviet Union in the General Assembly on the 6th of November for the Uniting for Peace resolution demanding a ceasefire. Now he moved from pressure to punishment. The instruments were financial and they were precise. Britain's application to draw on its International Monetary Fund quota was refused outright, and American officials made clear that no future application would be entertained while the occupation continued. The emergency oil lift from the Western Hemisphere, which the Middle East Emergency Committee had been organized to run, was withheld. and the Treasury let it be understood in the markets that the United States would not support sterling at its parity. The reserves had lost about $450 million in November, a seventh of the total in the real crisis when London had folded at midnight. Now the drain accelerated because the markets could see that the drain had no political endpoint. Selwyn Lloyd flew to Washington on 16 November and was received without warmth and without offer. No American soldier moved. No American ship sailed against a NATO ally. None needed to. Eisenhower had found that two great powers could be brought down with a ledger. Nasser did not negotiate. He moved the government to the Delta, broadcast twice daily from Cairo radio, and refused every proposal for a settlement that acknowledged the occupation's legitimacy. Politically, it was the only survivable position, and it worked. Across the Arab world, his standing rose, as it had risen in reality, not from any military success, but from the fact of defiance against an empire that had been condemned by its own protector at the United Nations. Inside Egypt, the accounting was harsher. The army that made the revolution in 1952 had lost Sinai in 6 days and the Canal Zone in 6 more, and it began to ask, quietly and in the wrong places, who was responsible. The answer everyone reached was Abdel Hakim Amer, commander-in-chief and Nasser's closest friend, whose conduct of the Sinai withdrawal had turned an ordered retreat into a rout. Officers who had been in the desert talked in the barracks at Al-Masa and Abbasiyah. Whether that talk would ever have become a movement is the least documented part of this story and the least knowable. Nasser had survived worse rooms than that one, but he had never before needed the army's forgiveness. At the same moment, he needed its obedience. Syria's army had cut the pumping stations of the Iraq Petroleum Company pipeline on 3rd of November. With the canal blocked, the pipeline down and no American oil, Western Europe lost the great majority of its Middle Eastern supply at the beginning of winter. Britain introduced petrol rationing in December and cut it again in January, to a fraction of what the real crisis required, because the real crisis had ended with a climbdown and an American oil lift. There was no lift now. Coal was moved to power stations at the expense of households. France, more dependent on Middle Eastern crude and with no sterling area to draw upon, rationed harder still. In West Germany and Italy, the recovery economies, which had grown at rates no one in 1946 would have predicted, ran into a wall of unavailable energy that had nothing to do with their own conduct and everything to do with a war two of their neighbors had chosen. It was the winter that turned European opinion, not the morality of the thing, the cold. Soviet armor had re-entered Budapest on 4th of November, and Bulganin's notes of 5 November had hinted, in language no one in London or Paris entirely believed, at rockets falling on their capitals. Moscow now finished the destruction of the Hungarian Revolution across the following fortnight with the West's moral position wholly spent. Imre Nagy was taken. The workers' councils were broken. 200,000 Hungarians went west across the Austrian border, and the governments that might have made their case at the United Nations were themselves in the dock there. Khrushchev understood the gift he had been handed and spent it carefully. Soviet arms, Soviet engineers, and Soviet loans went to Cairo. Soviet propaganda went everywhere else, and it did not have to exaggerate. In New Delhi, in Jakarta, in Accra, the comparison made itself. The Soviet Union never contemplated firing a rocket at London, and Britain's own intelligence assessed as much. It did not need to. The rhetoric cost nothing and bought a decade of standing in the non-aligned world. And then came the moment when the argument stopped being about Egypt at all. Sterling could not be held. By the second week of December, the Treasury was choosing between a parity it could not defend and terms from Washington that amounted to the same surrender, delayed and paid for with interest. Macmillan, who had wanted the operation in July and had wanted it stopped by mid-November, put the position to cabinet without softening. There was no third option, and there never had been. Eden went. His health gave the resignation its public form, as it had in reality, but the substance was that his own chancellor and his own party had concluded he had gambled the currency and lost. The government that followed inherited an occupation of 100 miles of blocked waterway that it could not afford to hold and could not abandon without conceding that the whole enterprise, the deceit at Sèvres, the breach with Washington, the dead at Port Said, had bought precisely nothing. It chose eventually to concede. The withdrawal was negotiated through the United Nations in the spring of 1957 on Egyptian terms, and the canal reopened later than it had in reality, under Egyptian management, with the compensation questions settled in Cairo's favor. The difference from the real climb down was not the outcome. It was that the outcome now arrived with the deceit fully exposed, the currency broken, and no way to describe the retreat as a decision. What followed was the same end of empire, without the cover of managed decline. In Baghdad, Nouri al-Said's pro-British government lost the last argument it had, that the British connection brought protection worth the humiliation, and lost it 2 years before it, lost it in reality, in a street that had already learned what an Arab government looked like when it defied London and survived. Within the Commonwealth, India and Pakistan and Ceylon had condemned the intervention while it was still an intervention. A completed occupation made the breach explicit and permanent, and the association never fully recovered the idea that it was something other than a former empire's waiting room. France drew a different lesson and drew it hard. Mollett's government concluded that the American alliance could not be relied upon when French interests were at stake, and the road that ran through Suez ran on to the French nuclear program, to the common market negotiations pursued as a European alternative to Atlantic dependence, and to a settled conviction that Washington was a partner and not a guarantor. Those things happened in reality too. They happened faster here, and with more bitterness behind them. The lesson of the real Suez was that Britain had learned in time. It halted at midnight, absorbed the humiliation, and spent the next decade converting a defeat into a withdrawal it could describe as policy. The lesson of this one is narrower and colder. Eden was not wrong that stopping halfway bought nothing. He was wrong about the alternative. The operation could be completed. The canal could be taken to its southern end and held. What could not be done was to make possession mean anything. Once the wrecks were in the channel, the oil was in American hands, and the power that had underwritten the pound had decided to stop. Some gambles fail because they are not carried through. This one shows the other kind. The gamble carried all the way to its object, arriving there to find the object gone and the bill waiting.